The HOA, for its part, had learned a lesson as well. Overreach, exaggeration, and intimidation had been met with clear evidence and calm reasoning. Their confidence had been challenged, and the resolution required acknowledgement of fairness and proper procedure. While Karen had not sought confrontation, the outcome reinforced the importance of transparency, accountability, and integrity in the exercise of authority. By the end of Part 4, Karen's life had returned to a more peaceful rhythm. The roses bloomed, the lawn was meticulously trimmed, and the quiet neighborhood once again felt like home. The experience had been challenging, stressful, and at times exhausting, but it had also been empowering. Karen had navigated the storm with patience, preparation, and calm resolve, proving that fairness and integrity could triumph over intimidation and overreach after weeks of tension. Letters and uncertainty, the neighborhood finally began to settle. The roses in Karen's garden bloomed more brightly than ever, and the freshly trimmed lawn reflected the care and patience she had poured into her home. It wasn't just about the flowers or the neat yard. It was a symbol of resilience, standing firm without giving in to pressure or fear. Karen often paused to look at her surroundings and felt a quiet satisfaction in seeing the calm restored. The days that followed the mediation and the formal withdrawal of the fines were filled with small but meaningful moments. Neighbors who had once avoided her now greeted her with friendly nods or casual waves. Some even stopped to chat briefly, apologizing for having distanced themselves during the weeks of tension. It was a subtle acknowledgement that she had handled the situation with dignity, that her commitment to fairness had been noticed. Karen's partner observed the change too. "It feels like life is back to normal," he said one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees. Karen smiled, feeling a deep sense of relief. Normalcy wasn't just the absence of conflict. It was the restoration of comfort, routine, and peace of mind. It was a feeling she hadn't realized she had missed so much until it returned. Despite the calm, Karen reflected on the journey with a sense of quiet awe. The situation had started with a seemingly small, almost trivial final letter slipped into her mailbox without warning, but it had grown into something far larger. It had tested her patience, challenged her principles, and required careful thought, preparation, and composure. She understood now that the process had revealed strengths she had not fully recognized in herself. By the end of the week, Karen felt a renewed sense of clarity. The police visit, though unsettling, had validated her position. She knew that she had done nothing wrong, and that the exaggeration by the HOA was on record. Her calm, prepared, and principled approach had proven effective, and she resolved to continue in the same manner. Looking out over her yard, she felt a quiet pride. The roses still bloomed, the lawn was pristine, and her home remained a place of care and beauty. The HOA could send letters, escalate complaints, and try to intimidate, but they could not take away the peace and integrity she cultivated within her own home. And so, as the sun set and the neighborhood grew quiet, Karen sat on her porch, reflecting on the week's events. She understood that challenges might continue, but she was ready. With careful preparation, clear documentation, and a calm, principled approach, she knew she could face whatever came next. The situation with the HOA had grown far beyond a simple fine, but Karen had learned that calm, clarity, and integrity could turn even an unexpected crisis into an opportunity for strength and resilience. The morning started quietly, almost peacefully. The sun filtered through the trees, casting soft shadows on Karen's yard, and the air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers. For a moment, it seemed as though the storm of tension that had hovered over her neighborhood might finally ease. But Karen knew better than to let her guard down completely. In the days following the police visit, there had been a noticeable shift in the neighborhood. The whispers and judgmental glances that had been so persistent were now tempered with curiosity and caution. People seemed more hesitant to spread rumors or stir up trouble, likely aware that law enforcement had already seen the situation. Karen noticed neighbors walking past her house with more polite smiles or nods. Rather than avoiding her entirely, she felt a quiet sense of relief, but also knew that the HOA's influence remained. Letters continued to arrive, though the tone was somewhat less aggressive. Karen read each one carefully, taking notes and adding them to her growing file. She continued photographing her yard, documenting every small change, every new letter, every interaction. Preparation had become second nature, a tool that gave her a sense of control amid the uncertainty. One morning, as Karen was tending to her garden, she noticed a car slowly pull into the driveway. It was not unfamiliar. In fact, it had been seen in the neighborhood before. But this time, there were two people inside. Not just one. They got out and approached the house with measured steps. Karen's partner, noticing her sudden pause, came to her side. "Do you know them?" he asked quietly. Karen shook her head. "Not exactly. Let's see what they want." The two visitors introduced themselves politely. They were not from the police, nor were they typical HOA representatives. Instead, they identified themselves as independent community mediators, individuals hired to resolve disputes within neighborhoods and associations. Their role was to understand both sides and propose solutions that were fair and reasonable. Karen felt a cautious hope rise within her. Perhaps this was an opportunity to resolve the situation without further escalation. She invited them in, offering water and a seat on the porch. They accepted politely, setting a small notepad on the table. "Thank you for allowing us to visit," one mediator began. "We've been asked to review the ongoing situation with the HOA and your property. Our goal is to ensure that any decisions or fines are fair and based on accurate information." Karen explained everything calmly, from the first letter to the police visit. She showed them her notes, her photographs, and her timeline. She explained the impact the letters and fines had had on her life, from the quiet anxiety to the way it affected her daily routines. The mediators listened carefully, occasionally asking questions for clarification. They were professional but empathetic, and their presence alone was a relief. Karen could see that they were taking her side seriously, not as a complaint, but as part of understanding the full story. After an hour of discussion, one of the mediators leaned back, nodding thoughtfully. "From what we can see, your actions have been reasonable, respectful, and fully compliant with community standards. The complaints from the HOA appear to be exaggerated and unsupported by evidence." Karen felt a surge of validation. Months of documentation, careful observation, and calm patience were finally paying off. The tension that had shadowed her days now had a tangible, positive turn. The mediators suggested a meeting with the HOA board, a structured discussion where both sides could present facts and reach a resolution. Karen agreed, understanding that this could be the key to ending weeks of stress. The mediators explained that they would facilitate the meeting to ensure fairness, and they would document everything officially. When the day of the meeting arrived, Karen prepared meticulously. She reviewed her notes, double-checked her photographs, and rehearsed calmly explaining her side of the story. Her partner supported her, reminding her to stay composed and focus on the facts. Together, they approached the HOA office, aware that this was a turning point. The HOA board was already assembled, looking confident, almost as if they expected Karen to be intimidated. But Karen stood tall, presenting her evidence with clarity and calm authority. She explained each interaction, showed the letters, and documented every step she had taken to comply with rules of ON. When the rules had been vague or inconsistently applied, the mediators guided the discussion, ensuring that interruptions were minimized and that the facts remained central. They asked questions that exposed inconsistencies in the HOA's complaints. When board members referenced community concerns, the mediators requested specific evidence. The responses were vague and unconvincing. Karen could see the shift in energy. The confidence of the board members was faltering. After 2 hours of careful discussion, the mediators summarized their findings. "The complaints against your property are unsubstantiated," one of them stated. "The fines issued were unjustified, and any further enforcement without evidence would be considered an overreach." Karen felt a sense of relief unlike anything she had experienced in weeks. The board members, faced with clear documentation, calm reasoning, and third-party validation, had no choice but to acknowledge the situation. Their confident demeanor had faded, replaced by hesitation and discomfort by the end of the meeting. The HOA agreed to formally withdraw all fines, remove any pending penalties, and cease further complaints regarding Karen's property. They also agreed to review their complaint process to prevent similar situations from arising in the future. Karen left the office feeling a mixture of relief, vindication, and quiet triumph. Months of stress, anxiety, and careful preparation had finally resulted in fairness. Back at home, she reflected on the journey. The situation had been far more than a simple fin. It had tested her patience, resilience, and ability to navigate pressure without reacting impulsively. She realized that her calm, methodical approach, combined with careful documentation and a willingness to engage through proper channels, had been the key to achieving a just outcome. The neighborhood slowly returned to a more peaceful state. Neighbors who had been cautious or distant began to interact more normally. Some apologized quietly for rumors or misunderstandings. The tension that had lingered like a shadow began to lift. Karen could finally enjoy her yard, her home, and her routines without the constant undercurrent of anxiety. Her partner noted the change immediately. "It's like a weight has been lifted," he said one evening, as they sat on the porch sipping tea. Karen nodded, feeling the truth of his words. The relief wasn't just about the fines, it was about reclaiming a sense of control, dignity, and normalcy. The experience also left Karen with a deeper understanding of the dynamics of authority, influence, and fairness. She realized that standing firm with integrity and calm reasoning could not only protect her rights but also shift the behavior of others. The HOA's overreach had been met not with anger or confrontation, but with patience, preparation, and persistence. In doing so, she had demonstrated that intimidation could be countered effectively without losing composure or civility. In the following days, Karen took time to restore her sense of peace. She focused on gardening, spent more time with her partner, and reconnected with neighbors who had been supportive. Each day, the sense of normalcy grew stronger. The letters stopped, the subtle scrutiny faded, and the neighborhood returned to the calm routine that had once seemed threatened. Karen also reflected on the personal growth that had come from the experience. She had learned to navigate pressure, assert her rights, and maintain composure under stress. She understood the importance of documentation, preparation, and clear communication. Most importantly, she recognized the value of patience, understanding that resolution often required measured, thoughtful action rather than impulsive reaction. Looking back, she realized that the ordeal had revealed strengths she hadn't fully acknowledged in herself. The combination of calm determination, careful documentation, and principled action had not only resolved the conflict, but it also earned her respect from the mediators and a few neighbors who had quietly observed her approach. The quiet neighborhood had changed. Once peaceful streets now carried an undercurrent of scrutiny and pressure. Karen had become aware of subtle power dynamics of the ways authority could influence behavior, and of the importance of standing firm in the face of intimidation. She realized that the outcome would not be decided by letters or whispers alone, but by her ability to remain calm, organized, and principled. And as the sun set on another day, Karen looked at her yard, her home, and the neighborhood she had lived in for so long. She felt a quiet resolve. The letters, the fines, and the escalating pressure were challenges, yes, but they were not insurmountable. She understood that patience, clarity, and careful action would guide her through whatever came next. The neighborhood might have changed, but Karen's determination had not. She was prepared to face whatever escalation came from the HOA, armed with evidence, calm reasoning, and unwavering commitment to fairness. She knew that the next steps would be crucial, and she was ready to meet them with dignity and strength. It started as a normal morning, but there was an odd tension in the air. Karen had woken early, as usual, to tend to her garden before the sun grew too hot. The roses were blooming beautifully, and the freshly trimmed lawn reflected the care she had always given it. She moved slowly, taking time to notice each flower, each leaf, as if the small beauty of her yard could shield her from the storm that had been brewing for weeks. She hadn't yet opened her mail when she noticed a car slowly driving past the house. At first, she thought it was a neighbor, but the vehicle circled the block, glancing toward her driveway more than once. Something about the way it moved felt deliberate. Karen felt a subtle chill. She had grown used to the quiet tension in the neighborhood, but this was different. It felt pointed, almost intentional. Her partner, noticing her unease, asked, "Do you want me to check who it is?" Karen shook her head. "Not yet. Let's just see." A few minutes later, the mail arrived, as it always did. Alongside the usual bills was another letter from the HOA. The tone had grown sharper. It stated almost ominously that continued noncompliance could result in further action, though it offered no specifics. Karen felt her frustration rising. The fines were still unjustified. The letters were now designed to intimidate rather than inform. She decided to ignore it for now. She had her records, her photographs, and her timeline. She was prepared. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was looming, a storm she couldn't yet see. A few hours later, there was a sudden, unexpected knock at the door. Karen looked through the window and saw two uniformed police officers standing outside. Her heart skipped a beat. She opened the door cautiously, surprised and anxious. "Good morning, ma'am," one of the officers said. "We received a report regarding your property and wanted to ask you a few questions." Karen blinked. "A report? About what?" The officer hesitated slightly, glancing at a notepad. "There was a concern raised that there might be some sort of disturbance or conflict related to your property. We're just checking to make sure everything is okay." Karen felt a mix of disbelief and anxiety. I don't understand. There's no disturbance here. I live quietly, tend to my garden, and follow the rules." The officers nodded politely, but maintained a professional distance. They asked for her identification, which she provided without hesitation. They began asking questions about the HOA letters, the fines, and whether anyone had threatened her or been aggressive. Karen explained everything calmly, detailing the letters, the phone calls, and her interactions with the HOA. She showed them her records, photographs, and notes, making sure to remain composed as she spoke. One of the officers flipped through the documentation, frowning slightly. He glanced up at her and said, "This doesn't seem like the kind of situation that usually requires police involvement. Were you threatened in any way?" Karen shook her head. "No, nothing like that. It's just letters, fines, and pressure from the HOA. I haven't done anything wrong, and no one has physically or verbally threatened me." The second officer nodded in agreement. "We see. Sometimes reports are made without the full story. Thank you for explaining everything." Karen felt a wave of relief, but also a lingering tension. The presence of the police, even if they were professional and polite, reminded her that the HOA's influence was reaching beyond her immediate expectations. The situation had grown far more serious than a simple disagreement over yard decorations. The officer spent another 15 minutes asking questions, taking notes, and reviewing the documents she had prepared. They were thorough but fair, and Karen realized that their role was not to take sides, but to understand the situation fully. She answered honestly, careful to remain calm and precise. Before leaving, the officers offered a few pieces of advice. "We can't intervene directly in HOA matters unless there is a legal violation," one officer said, "but it's clear that the report made to us exaggerated the situation. We recommend keeping all documentation and avoiding confrontations. If there are future reports, having clear records will be essential." Karen nodded, grateful for their professional approach. Once the officers left, she felt a mixture of relief, anger, and astonishment. She couldn't believe that the HOA had escalated matters to the point of involving law enforcement, especially when she had done nothing wrong. But at the same time, she recognized the unintended advantage. The situation had exposed the exaggeration in the OS complaints. She shared the experience with her partner, recounting every detail of the officer's visit. "It's shocking," he said. "They came here because someone made up a story. But at least now it's on record that nothing illegal or dangerous is happening," Karen agreed. She realized that while the visit had been intimidating, it had also provided validation. The police officers had seen the facts clearly, and the HOA's exaggeration could no longer go unchallenged. She felt a sense of quiet empowerment. Though the tension in the neighborhood was still palpable, over the next few days, Karen noticed subtle changes. The letters from the HOA continued to arrive, but she sensed caution in their tone. Perhaps the knowledge that police had been involved made them reconsider their approach. At the same time, she knew the situation was far from over. The HOA's influence, combined with the whispers of neighbors, created an ongoing pressure that required careful navigation. Karen continued her routine, tending to her garden, maintaining her yard, and keeping meticulous records. Every interaction with neighbors and every new letter was carefully noted. She avoided confrontations, focusing instead on calm observation and preparation. She understood that the HOA's tactics were designed to provoke, intimidate, and exhaust her patience, but she refused to react impulsively. One afternoon, she noticed a small group of neighbors lingering near her property. They were not confrontational, but their presence felt deliberate. Karen remained calm, waving politely and continuing her work in the yard. She understood that maintaining composure was as important as the documentation she kept. The HOA had tried to create tension, but she refused to let it dictate her actions. That evening, she reflected on the events of the week. The visit from the police had been unexpected, even startling. But it had also highlighted the exaggeration and overreach of the HOA. She felt a mixture of relief and determination. Relief that the situation was documented accurately, and determination to continue standing firm. She knew that patience, careful preparation, and a calm approach were her strongest tools. Karen also recognized the importance of communication. She began writing a clear, factual letter to the HOA, documenting every interaction and clearly stating her position. She didn't send it yet. She wanted to review it carefully, ensuring it was professional, calm, and unambiguous. Her goal was to assert her rights without escalating conflict unnecessarily. As days turned into a week, the neighborhood slowly adjusted to her steadfastness. Some neighbors whispered less, while others avoided unnecessary speculation. The presence of law enforcement in the narrative, though brief, had changed perceptions. Karen realized that standing firm with evidence and calm reasoning was more powerful than paying an unfair fine out of fear. She also began to plan for potential future escalation. What if the HOA tried to involve the police again? What if they made additional complaints or attempted to enforce further fines? Karen understood that preparation and documentation would be essential. She created a folder specifically for legal guidance, noting local ordinances and HOA regulations, ensuring that she could respond calmly and accurately if the situation escalated further. Despite the stress, Karen continued to focus on her daily life. She spent time with her partner, enjoyed quiet walks, and continued gardening. Maintaining normalcy was essential to preserve her peace of mind. She refused to let the HOA's actions dominate her life. Each day, she balanced preparation with living fully, understanding that resilience required both awareness and calm presence. Karen also noticed the impact on her partner. While supportive, he carried his own stress from the situation. She made sure to communicate openly, sharing concerns and strategies, ensuring that both of them were aligned. Together, they maintained a sense of partnership and mutual support, reinforcing their ability to navigate the challenges ahead. And so, with the letters still pinned to her fridge, a folder of evidence growing steadily on the counter, and a determination settling into her heart, Karen prepared for the unexpected. She didn't know exactly what would happen next, but she knew she would face it with calm and clarity. The first step in this new chapter was simple but powerful. She would not let an unfair fine define her life or her actions. It had been a few days since. Karen decided she wouldn't pay the fine immediately. At first, she had felt calm, almost certain that reason and fairness would prevail. But she soon realized that the situation was far from over. Small hints of tension began to appear, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but gradually growing into something more unsettling. The quiet neighborhood she had always loved started to feel a little heavier, as if invisible eyes were watching her every move. One morning, Karen noticed something strange. A note had been left on her porch. It was typed neatly, folded carefully, and it carried a tone that was more pointed than polite. The note reminded her of the fine and mentioned that additional measures could be taken if the situation was not resolved immediately. There was no signature, just a printed title, HOA Enforcement Department. Karen frowned, feeling her pulse quicken slightly. The message was clearly meant to intimidate. Even though it didn't say anything specific, she showed the note to her partner, leaned back in the chair, rubbing his temple. "This is getting ridiculous," he said. "It's like they're trying to scare you into paying. But it's still unclear what they think you did wrong." Karen nodded. "I know, and that's the problem. There's no clear explanation, only threats." Over the next week, more letters appeared, each one more stern than the last. Some mentioned community complaints, others hinted at fines accumulating rapidly. Each envelope carried the same sense of pressure, but without clarity or justification. Karen began to feel a creeping frustration. The letters were not just reminders, they were tools of control. She decided to reach out to neighbors again, this time more seriously. She walked door to door, talking to anyone who would listen. Most people sympathized but offered little advice beyond vague warnings about not crossing the HOA. A few neighbors had experienced similar issues in the past, but most had simply paid their fines quietly to avoid conflict. Karen felt a sense of isolation. While she knew she wasn't alone in principle, it was clear that few were willing to stand up, and even fewer were willing to help navigate the escalating situation. Karen also began noticing small, subtle changes in the neighborhood itself. People who had once smiled politely or waved casually now barely nodded. Conversations became clipped. On walks through the streets, she noticed more fences and beware of dog signs than usual. It was as though the HOA's influence had created an invisible barrier between her and the rest of the community. She felt scrutinized, judged, even though she had done nothing wrong. One afternoon, Karen decided to take a more proactive approach. She printed copies of all the letters, took pictures of her yard from every angle, and wrote down a timeline of every interaction with the HOA. She wanted to ensure she had clear evidence, not just for herself, but in case the situation escalated further. As she organized her documents, she felt a mixture of anger and determination. She was not going to be bullied, but she also realized she needed to be prepared for whatever might come next, despite her careful preparation. The tension in the neighborhood continued to grow. A neighbor approached her one morning, lowering their voice to a whisper. "I heard they're keeping a close eye on your house," they said, glancing nervously around. "You might want to be careful." Karen thanked them politely, but inside, her anxiety grew. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet suddenly, every movement, every small action felt under scrutiny. That evening, Karen's partner suggested something different. "Maybe we should consider speaking with the HOA in person," he said. "Sometimes a face-to-face conversation makes a difference. They might take us more seriously than just letters and phone calls." Karen hesitated. She didn't want to appear confrontational, but she also understood the logic. A calm, clear discussion might help. The next morning, they went to the HOA office, prepared with all of their documentation. The office was quiet, more formal than she expected, with neatly arranged desks and a receptionist who looked professional but distant. When they explained the situation, the representative listened for a few minutes before responding in a polite but firm tone. They said that the complaints about the yard were valid and that fines would continue unless Karen complied. When she asked for the names of the people who had complained, the representative hesitated, then said it was confidential. Karen tried to explain that she simply wanted to understand the issue so she could correct it if necessary. But the response was firm. The fines would continue regardless. Karen left the office feeling frustrated and more determined than ever. The situation was no longer just about a fine. It was about fairness, clarity, and standing up for herself. The HOA seemed more interested in control than resolution. She realized that paying the fine would not solve the underlying problem, and that silence would only encourage further escalation. Back at home, Karen tried to focus on daily life. She tended to her garden, prepared meals, and continued her regular routines. But the tension was always present. Every letter, every glance from neighbors, every unfamiliar car in the driveway reminded her that the conflict was ongoing. Even simple tasks like checking the mail became stressful. One afternoon, Karen noticed a group of people walking slowly past her house, pausing to look at her yard. It was not a threatening gesture, but it carried an unmistakable air of judgment. Karen felt a mixture of anger and frustration. Why should she feel uncomfortable in her own home? Why should her peace of mind be affected by letters, rumors, and vague complaints? As days turned into weeks, Karen's approach remained consistent. She documented everything meticulously, maintained her yard carefully, and avoided confrontations. But she also refused to pay a fine she felt was unfair. Her partner supported her, handling practical matters while Karen focused on strategy and preparation. They discussed possible scenarios, from paying the fine reluctantly to escalating the issue legally if necessary. Karen also began reaching out to broader resources. She researched local laws, community rights, and the limits of HOA authority. She discovered that while HOAs had certain powers, there were clear boundaries, and overreach could have consequences. This knowledge gave her a sense of empowerment. While she couldn't predict what the HOA would do next, she understood the rules of the game. She planned to use them carefully. The tension in the neighborhood continued to grow. Some neighbors whispered about her situation, while others avoided her altogether. Karen realized that standing up for herself had unintended social consequences. She felt isolated at times, but she also felt a quiet strength in knowing that she was acting with integrity. She refused to let intimidation dictate her behavior. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees lining the street, Karen sat on her porch and reflected on the situation. She realized that the fine was more than just a financial issue. It had become a test of patience, resilience, and principle. Every letter, every whispered conversation, every subtle glance from neighbors was part of a larger challenge. Karen understood that how she responded now would shape the outcome, and possibly influence the way the neighborhood functioned in the future. In the following days, the HOA's actions became more noticeable. Notices of fines were slipped under doors, letters appeared with increasingly urgent language. Subtle hints of monitoring seemed present. It was clear that the HOA was escalating in hopes of forcing compliance. Karen noticed the pattern. The more she resisted, the more pressure was applied. She realized that this was no longer about a single finite, had become a battle of principle, patience, and persistence. Despite the mounting pressure, Karen remained calm and methodical. She met every new notice with careful documentation, photographs, and written notes. She avoided public confrontations, but was prepared for any interaction. The quiet determination she exhibited began to influence her partner and even a few supportive neighbors. They admired her resilience, though they also cautioned her about the potential risks. Karen's life had changed subtly, but profoundly. Simple routines were now observed with caution. Social interactions carried underlying tension. And even quiet evenings on the porch were tinged with awareness of possible scrutiny. Yet, she refused to be defeated. She focused on preparation, research, and careful observation, understanding that maintaining calm and clarity was her strongest tool. By the end of the second week, Karen had gathered a substantial record: photographs of her yard, copies of all letters, a detailed log of dates and events, and notes on every interaction with neighbors in the HOA. She felt a sense of control, even amid the tension. She knew that the situation could escalate further, but she was ready. It was a calm, ordinary morning in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun had just started to peek over the rooftops, and the sound of birds chirping mixed with the distant hum of lawnmowers. The streets were lined with neat houses, trimmed lawns, and little signs of the everyday life of families who had lived there for years. For most people, it was the kind of neighborhood where doors were left unlocked. Neighbors waved as they passed each other, and the biggest concern on any day was the occasional barking dog or the smell of fresh cookies baking in someone's kitchen. Karen had lived in her house for almost a decade. She knew most of the people on her street, and though she wasn't friends with everyone, she had a good rapport with her immediate neighbors. She loved the routine and comfort of living in a place where nothing surprising usually happened. But that morning, something completely unexpected arrived in her mailbox. It was a letter with a rigid, official tone, stamped with the logo of the Homeowners Association. Karen felt a sinking feeling in her stomach as she read the first lines. The letter claimed she owed a fine for violations of community standards related to her front yard. She blinked and read it again, certain she must have misunderstood. She looked at her yard. The flowers were neatly planted, the grass was trimmed, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. Everything had always been meticulously maintained. Nothing looked out of place. She called out to her partner, who was in the kitchen making coffee. "Hey, can you come look at this?" she said, holding the letter in her hand. Together, they read it carefully, each line making them feel more frustrated. The HOA claimed they had numerous complaints about her yard decorations and the type of plants she had used, and now a fine had been issued. Her partner frowned. "Complaints? From who?" "I don't know. I don't remember anyone ever saying anything," Karen replied. She felt a mix of confusion and irritation. The letter was stern and demanded immediate payment. It didn't offer any room for discussion or clarification. It was the kind of letter that made her feel like she had already done something wrong, even though she knew she hadn't. For the rest of the day, Karen couldn't stop thinking about it. She walked around her yard inspecting every flower, every plant, every decoration. Everything was exactly as it had been for years. Nothing had changed. She even asked her neighbors if they had received similar letters, but everyone she spoke to seemed surprised. Some had fines before, but for different issues, never for something like this. Karen decided to call the HOA office. She wanted to understand what exactly was wrong. The phone rang for a long time before someone finally picked up. When she explained the situation, the voice on the other end sounded polite but distant. The representative read from a script repeating that she owed the fine and that there were complaints about her yard. Karen tried to ask for details: who had complained, what exactly the issue was, and whether she could remedy it before paying a fine. But the answers were vague and unhelpful. The person on the phone insisted that she must pay immediately, and there was no room for negotiation. Feeling frustrated, Karen hung up the phone. She sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the letter, thinking about what to do next. Paying the fine seemed unfair, especially when she hadn't done anything wrong. But ignoring it entirely might cause bigger problems later. She felt trapped between following her conscience and complying with an authority that seemed arbitrary and unreasonable. Over the next few days, Karen kept the letter in a visible spot, almost like a reminder of the stress that had quietly crept into her life. She noticed small changes in her own behavior. She hesitated to leave her house without checking her yard, and she felt a subtle pressure whenever she saw HOA board members in the neighborhood. Even casual conversations with neighbors were tinged with caution. It was as if a small shadow had fallen over the routine of her life. Her partner noticed the change and tried to help. "Maybe we should just pay it," he suggested gently one evening as they sat together after dinner. "It might make things easier." Karen shook her head. "I can't. It's not right. I didn't do anything wrong. Paying this just feels like admitting guilt for something I didn't do." They debated back and forth. Karen thought about the principle of the situation, about fairness and standing up to something that seemed unjust. Her partner worried about the practical consequences, about what might happen if the HOA escalated the situation. They both knew that ignoring a fine could lead to more trouble. But the idea of complying without cause made Karen feel uneasy. As days turned into a week, Karen noticed subtle signs of tension in the neighborhood. Some neighbors began whispering when she walked by. Others avoided eye contact. Even though she didn't confront anyone, the feeling of being judged or watched was unsettling. The HOA seemed to have a quiet but noticeable influence over the street. Karen realized that what had started as a simple fine was beginning to affect more than just her finances. It was affecting her peace of mind. Karen decided to document everything. She made a folder with copies of the letter, notes about her phone call with the HOA, photos of her yard, and a detailed log of dates and interactions. She knew that if things escalated, having clear records would be important. She spent hours each day making sure everything was meticulously organized, almost like preparing for a legal challenge. Even though she hoped it wouldn't come to that, she wanted to be ready. Her friends were shocked when she told them about the fine. Many of them couldn't believe that a homeowners association could be so strict over something as small as a yard decoration. They shared stories of their own minor conflicts with HOA rules, but most had resolved them quietly by complying or adjusting a small detail. Karen's situation felt different. The letter had no room for compromise, and the implied threat of escalating fines hung over her like a storm cloud. Karen started to notice how the fine affected her daily routine. She double-checked her car in the driveway, her mailbox, even small details like trash cans being slightly out of place. Normally trivial things now carried weight. She found herself imagining scenarios where the HOA might call again, or where neighbors might report her for something else minor. Every small decision felt like it could have consequences she hadn't considered, despite all the stress. Karen tried to maintain normalcy. She continued with work, took walks in the evening, and kept her home clean and welcoming. She smiled at neighbors when they passed, tried to act as if nothing had changed, but deep down, she carried the tension with her. The quiet fear of unfair treatment lingered in her thoughts, even in moments of calm. Her partner suggested reaching out to a community mediator, someone who could act as a neutral third party. Karen thought about it, but hesitated. Would it even help? Or would it just bring more attention to the issue? She decided to wait and observe, hoping the situation might resolve itself. But every day that passed without a resolution only increased the pressure she felt. One weekend, Karen spent hours tending to her garden. She planted new flowers, trimmed hedges, and made sure everything looked perfect. But even as she worked, the fine lingered in her mind. She realized that no matter how beautiful her yard looked, the letter from the HOA had already created a tension that simple flowers couldn't erase. She felt caught between two worlds, the world she had always known, calm and predictable, and the new world of unexpected rules, fines, and vague authority. As the sun set, Karen sat on her porch, sipping tea and thinking about what might come next. She didn't feel defeated, but she felt cautious. The neighborhood she had loved for so long now seemed to have hidden challenges she hadn't expected. The fine, small as it seemed, had opened a door to conflict, uncertainty, and stress that she could never have imagined when she first moved in. And yet, she resolved not to let fear dictate her actions. She would stay calm, gather evidence, and prepare herself. If the HOA wanted a fight, she would meet it with facts, patience, and dignity. She didn't yet know what the next chapter would bring, but she felt a quiet determination. Something as simple as a yard fine should not control her life. By the end of the week, Karen had spoken to a few more neighbors. Some were sympathetic, some warned her to comply quickly. The mix of advice, opinions, and personal experience created a complex web of perspectives. Karen felt more informed, but also more aware of the stakes. The fine was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of tension, control, and the unpredictable nature of authority at night. As she lay in bed, she replayed the day's events in her mind. Every word of the letter, every conversation with the HOA, every glance from a neighbor who seemed curious or judgmental came back to her. The fine had become bigger than its simple monetary value. It had become a challenge, a test of patience, fairness, and resilience. Karen realized that the way she responded now could shape not only the immediate outcome, but the way she experienced her home, her neighborhood, and her peace of mind in the months to come.